is I'll cut a piece of bezel material that I know is going to work to fit around my stone. And I'm going to file what I call a reference in. That's the first thing I do. I take my big flat file, keep my elbow straight into my ribs, hold this tight in my fingers, so just about 1/8 of an inch or so is sticking out beyond my fingers. Hold my file on the bench pin, hold this down. That's that bridge I'm always talking about. So instead of coming out here like this in outer space, I have no bridge, right? I'm just filing willy-nilly. My hand can move around. My file is going to force my hand when I push it. So I brace my fingers on the bench pin, get the file, put those on the bench pin, and then push nice and smooth and easy straight away. I want to see this move in a straight line. If it moves in a curve like that, that's typically what's going to happen when your elbow's out here. You push and it's naturally going to go in a curve just because the ergonomics of that angle of your elbow being up. Keep your elbow in and just watch this go straight away from you. Well, not straight, it's going to go at an angle because I'm holding this at an angle. If I was holding this straight, then it would go straight away from me. But nice and perpendicular. 1 stroke, 2 strokes. Get that little pinch, because when you cut with these, even though these are considered flush cutters, they don't cut a perfectly flush line. So you want that. So there's my reference in. That's already filed, it's done, ready to go. So now I need to bend this around my stone and bring this in to meet this in at the appropriate size for my stone. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll go across that file, and just because it leaves a little bit of a burr, and I'll file that burr away too. So now I don't feel that little burr on the end of my wire. Fingers are big and pudgy compared to this little tiny stone. So I'll take my pliers, there's a combination, there's a 1/2 round flat. And I know what I want to do is I want to put the seam of my bezel on the long end of an oval stone. On a round stone, it doesn't matter where you put it because the circle is circumference. It doesn't change from one side to the other. Here, though, I want the long side rather than the short side because that's going to be the harder part to push the bezel over. And if it gets up too thick a solder, it just makes it a little tough to do. But the rule of thumb is to put the seam on the long side of your bezel or long side of your stone. Take your forming pliers and you're going to make a J shape. And I'm not squeezing really hard. This is fine silver. It bends super easy. But I'm just in my mind's eye. I'm kind of looking at that. And I'm closing this up to where it's close. There's my J shape right there. Okay? And then I put that down on the table and bring that up. And it's like, oh, I realize that's a pretty good bend. It's really close to the shape of that stone. So I'll continue that a little bit more. Take my pliers, come up a little further on the metal here. And I'm not squeezing really hard. It's just real gentle. I'm just using the pliers as a fulcrum to bend this material. Okay, that's starting to look good. And that's where I want the seam, is on the long side of the stone over there. All right, and look down at it. That looks pretty darn good. Continue to bend it now. Then you get to a point where you're real close to the shape of your stone. And see how I just squeeze and bend and squeeze and bend, real gentle. Small bends rather than real sudden bends to keep that curve nice and smooth. Test that on there. That looks pretty good. Now I can see where there's a gap up here. I continue to bend that around. I come down more on the metal here and make that a little tighter bend. But again, real gentle squeezing. So be patient. Now look how that's nicely forming around top. Now I can take, what I like to do is take the wedge of my ring clamp. Because if I try and push this over with my fingers are kind of cushy. And if I've got calluses or something, I could accidentally, and this is fairly thick bezel, so it's harder to push this over. But if I accidentally push the bezel over, away from its vertical position, then it distorts the bezel. So I want it to stay as vertical as possible. So by using the...
when that happens, it is a pain to try and flatten it.
It is. So if I use the wedge of my ring clamp and I pin it down with my fingers over here and form the rest of it around with the wedge has got a nice vertical sidewall. It stays flat on here, and I just wrap it around and it pushes up against there really nicely. And then I can reposition it, pinch the top of this together, form it around my stone. That's what I want to do. Okay? Now watch what happens. When I pick this bezel up, the stone stays down there. When I drop the bezel on it, it goes around the stone. But I haven't soldered anything yet, so it's a little bit different, and I haven't measured this yet. I've got a pretty good overlap here. And I'm going to give you guys a piece of material. When I do this in my studio at home, I use this coil right here, and I leave it attached, and I pull this out, and I do my little J shape here, and then this would actually be attached like that. And then I come in here with my little scribe with the stone in position, and I pinch this relatively tight, and this is going to sort of be over here, and sometimes it's a little bit of a pain. You got to wrap it up, and that's why I keep this little twist tie on there so that it makes this more easy to manipulate. I twist that around, use my wedge to push it in tight, and I know that the curl on the inside, that's that one that I already filed. That's my reference point. Then I take my scribe, pinching this together tight, and I, right where this inside piece of the bezel and the outside bezel is overlapping it, right at the end of that part that I filed right there, I'm going to put a little mark. And it doesn't have to be a scratch, but it could be just a little point, or if you want to make a scratch, like come up a little bit. Doesn't have to be the full length. You can even just poke in and make a little point. But then I've got a little mark right there, okay? So I know at that mark, that's where this part of the bezel overlaps that. Now again, this would, in my studio, I'd have this still attached. Then I'd pick this up, I'd uncurl it a little bit, take my cutters, and I'm looking at that line that I just cut. I want to still see the line. When I cut this, I don't want the line to disappear. So I'm cutting a little bit long of my line. Okay. So there's my line, get my flush cutters, try and get them as perpendicular to the sidewall as you possibly can, and snap that guy right off, okay? Now this is not a good finished end. It's got a little funny pinch. You can see a burr on there. So now I take my coil, get that out of the way. In this situation, I've got a little 1/2 inch. The reason I like to leave it on the coil is you make 3 bezels and you have this little 1/2 inch, which isn't really good for anything. If I make 3 bezels, then I'm losing the ability to make one more bezel, because 3 times that would be enough to make another bezel. And this really is